Well, good evening and welcome to this Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall webinar. It's great to have you all with us tonight, and it'll be a great session with Dan Schnur's Political Report for the month of May. It should be a very interesting session tonight, so we certainly want you to be involved and have questions. If you have a question, all you need to do is go to the bottom of your screen and see the question and answer button there. Write your question on there, and after about 30 minutes, Katie Gilman will manage your questions and ask those to Dan. And by the way, I'm Dr. Richard Downey. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council Town Hall, and it's a real pleasure to have all of you here with us tonight. By the way, I want to make sure that you know the good news. We are trying to do something different next month, the month of June, for the Dan Schnur Political Report, and we want to do part of it in person. So that those of you who are able to join us in person will find the right venue, can join us there on live session. And those of you, it'll be a hybrid for those of you who can't make it or somewhere across the country or would prefer to do it on webinar. That'll be an option for you as well. So we want to try that out and see how it works and go from there. Also, I want to let you know of a couple of upcoming events that you may be interested in. On Monday, this coming Monday, the 6th of May, Senator Steve Daines from Montana is going to be joining us at the California Club. It's 1 o'clock on Monday, and that should be a really interesting session. He's with all that's going on, on unrest on campuses and all that's going around the world. It should be interesting to get some insight from the Congress from Senator Daines. On the 22nd of May, we have Administrator Isabel Guzman, who is the 27th Administrator of the Small Business Administration, and she'll be talking about the business environment for small businesses, how we're trying to advance that through lending and other ways. Then on the 28th by the way, that's at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, that event on the 22nd with Administrator Guzman. Then on the 28th of May, we have the honor of an event with Mayor Karen Bass, and she'll be talking about the future of global Los Angeles, which should be a very, very interesting event is at the Ebell Auditorium in Los Angeles. So please join us for that. I wish I could see out there, or ask you to raise your hand and see how many of you are actually members of the World Affairs Council Town Hall. If you are not, certainly are delighted to have you with us, but we sure could use your help and support as a member. So if you're not a member, please consider joining the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall. We really enjoy having you as a member, and we'll welcome you to all our events. But right now, let's get ready for a great session with Dan Schnur. Dan, please take it away.
Richard, thank you so much. And like you, I'm really looking forward to next month's in-person session. As many of you longer-time audience members know, this program actually began as an in-person breakfast series all the way back in 2019. And then, of course, we moved to Zoom in the spring of 2020 and have remained here ever since. So it'll be very exciting to be able to see those of you in the greater LA area in person once again. And for those of you in other parts of the state or other parts of the country, I understand they're working on the technology, as Richard said, to allow us to do this as a hybrid. So you'll still be able to participate even if we are in person. So that's going to be a lot of fun. But anyway, we've got Katie and I have a lot to discuss tonight. And in particular, although it was not one of our marketed topics, we certainly want to talk about the extraordinary unrest that has roiled college campuses across the country over the last couple of weeks. And of course, even though we have spent a great deal of time talking about the Middle East for the last 6 months, we'll want to talk more about the cause of all that unrest. But before we get to that, I did want to start with a topic that we had originally put together for tonight's program, and that is the potential impact of the non-major party candidates on this race. Clearly, Biden and Trump are going to be their respective party nominees, barring some extraordinary occurrence. But we thought tonight it would be helpful to talk primarily about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but what the presence of these other candidates is going to mean on the ballot. And I want to frame that discussion by offering you a concept that some of you may have read about, but it's a concept that's evolved in American politics over the last decade or so. And the concept that political scientists now refer to is when they talk about a voter who doesn't like either candidate, they now refer to those voters as double haters. And in an era of negative partisanship, in which more and more people cast their ballots, not for the candidate or the party who they admire or look up to, but rather cast their ballot against the candidate or the party who they dislike more, that negative partisanship has led to this increasingly large cohort of voters who don't like either candidate, the double haters. And in 2016, Donald Trump benefited from the majority support of those voters. He obviously represented change. Clinton, although she was not the incumbent president, represented to a lot of voters more of a politics as usual approach. And so in retrospect, it shouldn't have been surprising that Trump, as the outsider, did attract a majority of the votes of those so-called double haters. Then in 2020, that switched. And in the 2020 election, Biden actually benefited from those voters. It was a smaller group in 2020 who disliked both. But those who did preferred Biden. And that played a major role in his ability to win the general election. Now, this year, in 2024, the number of double haters is larger than ever. Roughly 1/4 of the entire electorate says that they don't like either candidate. But now, as was the case back in 2016, Trump again enjoys the advantage with this group. And it's not because voters are becoming more enamored of Trump, although his poll numbers have gone up in recent months. But the reason Trump now has an advantage with these double haters is that a lot of these voters who don't like either Biden or Trump now have other options. And Robert F. Kennedy, most notably, and Jill Stein and Cornel West are attracting the largest amount of non-major party support that we've seen since the 1992 election, when Ross Perot, as some of you with long memories may recall, was actually winning the election, running ahead of both Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush for a period of time. And so, at least at the outset, it appeared that this multiple party activity was working to Trump's benefit, because somebody who didn't like either one could vote for Kennedy or one of the others. And if you think about it, this presents a real strategic challenge for Biden. Biden, throughout his entire career, you've all heard him say it, you've all read him saying it. One of Biden's favorite sayings is to say, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. Hey, you may not love me, but I'm better than the other one. Well, that works really well when there's one other candidate. But when there's three others, at least, the voters don't know much about, that's a much riskier approach. And so the challenge for Biden going forward is not simply to make voters dislike Donald Trump, but to try to bring them back into his own camp. And as we'll talk about tonight, and my guess is for the next several months, that is going to be a considerable challenge, because the lesser of two evils approach is a pretty straightforward equation. This one, not so much. In any case, if Katie's around, I know we want to turn this into a conversation, first between me and her, and then, as we always do, including as many of you as possible. First with poll questions in the first half an hour, and then with your own questions that Katie will read to all of us in the second half hour. So Katie, thanks for joining me. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Dan?
I'm good. I have to admit, I feel like with all the news coming from college campuses around the country right now, that's something I know everybody wants to talk about, but it probably does make sense to start with this topic first and then broaden, don't you think?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And thanks so much for providing a brief outline of our discussion tonight. On the topic of third party candidates, I want to first ask you, How seriously should we take the candidacy of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the other third-party candidates?
Well, we should take them very seriously. Kennedy in particular, because as I mentioned a moment ago, he is drawing, depending on the poll, anywhere between mid-teens to mid-20s support. And for a third-party candidate, again, we haven't seen that since Ross Perot ran for president more than 30 years ago. So we don't yet know what states will have Kennedy on the ballot, but it does appear that he's qualified in the key swing state of Michigan. And we just learned earlier this week he may have qualified here in the state of California, obviously a deep blue state, but still a potential impact for him. But for a candidate drawing at that level of support in the polls, he would almost certainly be included in the fall debates. And that would create an entirely different dynamic than just Biden against Trump one-on-one. West and Stein are drawing much less support. But as we know from looking back at the 2016 campaign, when Stein ran for president and drew more votes in the state of Wisconsin than was the difference between Clinton and Biden, between Clinton and Trump. In other words, if Jill Stein had not run and all of her votes had gone to Hillary Clinton, Clinton would have won the election. And for those with longer memories, once again, you go back to 2000. And of course, the several hundred votes that separated George W. Bush and Al Gore in Florida was much, much smaller than the number of votes that Ralph Nader received in that state. So this is the potential to have a huge impact. One, because Kennedy is drawing so much polling support right now, and we'll talk later about whether we think that's going to sustain, but also because it doesn't take many votes. It doesn't take many votes in a closely contested swing state to swing the election in one direction or another. So this is definitely something worth keeping an eye on as we go forward. But I think before I go any further, if we can, let's put up our first poll question for the audience, for our group, and let's see what they think about all this. First question, as all of you can see, is pretty straightforward. It's almost statistical. It's statistical. What percentage of the vote do you believe Kennedy will attract on election day? Now, do you think he'll get 19% of the vote or more, which is more than Ross Perot got in 1992? Will he get between 9 and 19%? Because 9% is roughly the numbers that George Wallace drew when he ran as a third-party candidate in 1968. Will he draw between 3 and 9%? Ralph Nader, of course, drew roughly 3% of the national vote in the 2000 election. So will he draw at a Perot or more level, at a Wallace or more level, at a Nader or more level, or none? He'll drop out between now and election day. And there's a lot of people working very hard to convince him to do so. We obviously don't know whether that's the case or not. And then fifth and finally, of course, if he qualifies on enough ballots in enough states, there's always the possibility that he'd be elected president. And Katie, what do you think? If you had to guess, how many people in our audience do you think are going to predict that Kennedy will be elected president? Yeah, I don't think it's going to be that high a number either, but let's see what the results show. I was one off. One person thinks that Kennedy will be elected president. But very interesting looking at the rest of the numbers. Only 4%, not that many more, think he'll get elected president. Only 4% of our group tonight thinks that Kennedy will draw 19% of the vote or more than Ross Perot. 34% believe it'll be somewhere in the teens, somewhere between 10 and 19%, which is more than George Wallace, but less than Perot. 55% believe that Kennedy will draw between 3 and 9%, which is certainly not enough to come anywhere close to winning the election. But as we talked about earlier, could without a doubt end up impacting the outcomes in several of the closely contested swing states around the country. 5% think he'll drop out, but to me, the real takeaways here is almost 9 out of 10 of our group believe that he'll draw more than Nader or Wallace, and more than half see him in the single digits. Very, very interesting. What I'd like to do is, rather than just continuing on, with my stuff, is I'd like to ask the second question, if we can. Now that you've told us as a group how many votes you think Kennedy is going to attract, here's another question. Which candidate will be harmed more by Kennedy's candidacy? Trump or Biden are about the same. Now, I spoke earlier about how this complicates Biden's challenge. It's no longer a lesser of two evils choice. But as we'll talk about in a few minutes, it appears that there's some complications and some difficulties that Kennedy's candidacy presents for Trump as well. And we're beginning to see that in public opinion polls. So even more straightforward than the first question for our group, who do you think gets hurt more by Kennedy? Trump, Biden, or about the same? Let's see what we got. Wow, look at that. I would not have predicted that in the slightest. 62% believe that Biden will be hurt more. Only 13% believe it's going to hurt, that Kennedy's candidacy is going to hurt Trump. And about a quarter say the same. But almost two-thirds of our group thinks that Biden gets hurt more. That's pretty wild, huh?
I think so. And I actually have a question for you, Dan, that I've been curious about throughout these poll questions. Which group of voters is Kennedy most likely to attract?
Well, and that's the logical outgrowth from the question we just put to our group. In other words, if our group believes that Biden gets hurt more, then the presumption is that more Biden supporters leave their candidate to go for Kennedy than Trump supporters make that decision. And for several months, that looked to be exactly the case. And so our group is right on that. So for many months, we saw polls that showed Democrats, particularly progressive Democrats, who are not all that happy with Biden for any number of reasons, recognize Kennedy's name, know that he carries very strong credentials in the environmental and climate change community. And so for a significant period of time, late last year and early this year, it did appear that Biden was losing more Democrats to Kennedy than Trump was losing Republicans. But that seems to be changing. Kennedy has been campaigning very, very aggressively in conservative news media. He's been on Fox News a lot. He's been doing a lot of Newsmax. And he talks about issues. For example, as most of you know, Kennedy was a very strong opponent of the use of vaccines during the pandemic. And that's much more likely to appeal to an extremely conservative voter than a progressive one. Kennedy, although he lines up with Democratic policies on the environment, in taxes, for example, but he has made some very conservative statements on immigration. Kennedy has articulated a very challenging or very restrictive policy at the border. And Kennedy also has spoken out very strongly in favor of gun ownership at the expense of gun control. Most interestingly, Kennedy has also indicated that he would be open. He didn't say he would, but he said he'd be open to potentially pardoning Trump supporters who engaged in the Capitol riots on January 6, 2021. And so what we're now seeing in recent polling is that, in fact, Kennedy is taking more votes from Trump as a result of all this than he is from Biden. And for those of you who do not follow Donald Trump's social media platforms, and I know that's at least a few of you, what's been noticeable is that while the Democratic National Committee has been criticizing Kennedy for months, just in the last week or two, Trump has started to post some very harsh attacks against Kennedy. So it's clear that Trump, if not his advisors, are becoming increasingly concerned that his campaign, rather than Biden's, could be more harmed by Kennedy. The honest truth is we don't know, and it's impossible to predict this many months out. But after many months of believing that Kennedy definitely hurt Biden more, there is recent polling information and more recent campaign activity suggesting that he might be taking a chunk out of Trump also.
Very interesting. Thanks so much.
So the other, we did, as we said earlier, we can definitely come back to this conversation. And for those of you who want to talk about Kennedy and their third-party candidates, of course we will. But as I did mention at the outset, there is an awful lot of other things going on in the news right now. Katie and I made the considered editorial decision not to include the Trump trial in New York City is one of our topics this week, although once again, we're more than happy to talk about it in the second half hour when we get there in just a little bit. But we really did want to talk about the protests and in some cases the riots, we'll just say the unrest that we're seeing on college campuses across the country, from Columbia in New York and Yale on the East Coast to UCLA and USC here in Los Angeles. This has become a national challenge. And it really does, in addition to the message that it sends about the debate in the Middle East, really does have the potential to have a very dramatic impact on the presidential election, most notably with young people. We talked earlier briefly, and we've talked many times in the past about how Biden has really struggled with his base. While Trump, the greatest challenge, is winning over swing voters in the middle of the political spectrum, Biden's actually doing okay in the center. But his own party's base, particularly young people, particularly voters from minority communities and other progressives, are not sold on Joe Biden. And this debate over Gaza is creating what was already a very potentially impactful challenge to Biden and making it much more impactful. So not only are these protests important in their own right, but make no mistake, they may end up having a very large impact on the election between now and November.
Mm-hmm. Well, what is it about Biden that makes him fail to get more support from younger voters?
Well, this is nothing new. Young people, like other progressives who make up the base of the Democratic Party, were never all that excited about Joe Biden back in 2019 and 2020. Most of them were very strong. Most of these voters were very strong supporters of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, some of Kamala Harris, and the other more progressive candidates in the race. And if you remember, it was only as the campaign began to progress that Democrats, so nervous about the prospect of another 4 years of Trump, unified, consolidated behind Biden. And progressives did so not because they grew to love Biden, but because they came to believe in a very calculated way that he was the most likely Democrat to be able to defeat Donald Trump. So they sort of held their nose and they voted for him. And over the course of the last 4 years, these progressive voters, in particular, many, many young people, these young people have been disappointed in his, what they feel has not been an aggressive enough stance on climate change, on police reform, on college loans. You may have seen just yesterday, the Biden administration announced that they were going to reclassify marijuana as a less damaging narcotic. And that's widely being viewed as a way of Biden sending a message to young people who find that issue to be a very important one. Similarly, he has directed billions and billions of dollars to student loan forgiveness in an effort to reach these voters too. So these are voters, young people and other progressives, who never liked Biden all that much, who've been disappointed in him over the last 4 years. And Gaza has become almost a symbol of a much broader range of points of dissatisfaction. And it's become a rallying cry for them. So I think the question that we'll ask our group, and then we'll dig into this a little bit deeper, is we want to get your opinions, both not only the young people in our audience, but for those of you who have children or grandchildren who are Gen Z. How do you think this age group will vote on election day? And we'll say arbitrarily the age group that gets polled in this category is aged 18 to 29. So the question is, how do you think young people will vote this November? Will they vote heavily for Biden the way they did 4 years ago? Will they vote for Biden by just a small margin, given a lessening of enthusiasm? Will they split pretty evenly between Biden and Trump? Will they lean slightly for Trump, or will they switch all the way over and vote heavily for Trump in November? And let's see what our group has to say on this one. Very interesting. 73%, almost 3/4 of our group, believes that young people will vote slightly for Biden. Only 11%, barely 1 in 10, believe they'll vote for him as heavily as they did 4 years ago. Only 2% believe they'll vote for Trump, either slightly or heavily. But 73% say slightly for Biden. And what I will tell you is that our group's instinct on this very closely reflects what we're seeing in public opinion polls right now. And for those of you who are watching this on Thursday night, I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, to read Tom Edsall, Edsall, Tom Edsall's piece in today's New York Times about young people. And what Edsall correctly points out is that back in 2020, this age group voted for Biden by roughly a 40-point margin. Now they're only voting for him by 1 or 2 percentage points. But what Edsall goes on to talk about is a very, very noticeable gender gap among young people. In other words, the reason that Trump is doing so much better among these younger voters is almost exclusively because of shifts among young men. Young women are still supporting Biden just as strongly as they did 4 years ago, not only on abortion rights, but on a number of other issues. It's the young men who seem to be moving. And that's something we'll need to keep an eye on as the election goes forward. I guess the other way of thinking about this is not only do young people have very strong opinions about Gaza, like they do about climate change, like they do about police reform and the other issues we've talked about. The difference is those young people are not engaging in mass protests on college campuses across the country on all those other issues the way they are with Gaza. And Biden has had to walk a very challenging line. He made a statement today in which he talked about the right to protest, but also made it clear that violence was unacceptable. Biden, will be speaking on Tuesday. He'll be giving a much larger and broader speech about anti-Semitism in the country. But so far, he hasn't had a great deal to say on this yet. And one of the things that a lot of political observers are watching very closely is, given that young people have been relatively unenthused about Biden, given how strongly many of them feel about the situation in the Middle East, the question, if we can put this up for our group again to weigh in, a lot of people are now wondering, how much will all this campus unrest impact the elections in November? And once again, we're going to ask your opinion. Will it hurt Biden significantly? Will it hurt him a large amount? Will it hurt Biden, but only a little, only slightly? Will it hurt Trump? A lot of the Democrats make the case that a lot of the problems in the Middle East festered under Trump's presidency and that he deserves responsibility for what's occurred. So it might hurt him slightly. Fourth option, will it hurt Trump to a much greater degree? Or finally, it won't make a difference, or at least the two sides will balance each other out and it won't help one candidate more than the other. Well, let's see what we got. Let's see what we got from that. Wow. 35% say it'll hurt Biden a lot. 48% say it'll hurt him a little bit. 83% of our group, Katie, believes that Biden's going to be hurt by this campus unrest. A grand total of 2% think it'll hurt Trump, and 15% say that it won't make a difference. But 83%, more than 8 out of 10 of our group, believes that Biden will be hurt by this. And I have to tell you that while I don't think that's a definite, I think it certainly has the potential to harm Biden's campaign. For several months now, I've believed, and I think I've said it on this program in the past, you've heard me say that I believe that if Biden is not reelected in November, it will largely be as a result of the Gaza war. But over the last couple of weeks, I think I'd like to adjust that a little bit, because I don't think it's the war itself. And I know we'll talk again, and we'll talk about this in just a minute or two before we go to our audience questions. I don't think it's the war that's going to end up hurting Biden to that extent. And in fact, I think there may be a path emerging for peace, or at least a lessening of the violence in the Middle East going forward. So instead of saying if Biden loses, it will be Gaza that costs him the election, what I'd now suggest to all of you is that if Biden is not reelected, it will be not because of the Gaza war, but it will be because of the American reaction to the Gaza war that could cost him reelection. Obviously, this is an issue that very deeply divides the Democratic Party. And if this could mean that young people and other progressives stay home, that creates a much, much greater challenge for Biden. And if these protests are still going on in the fall, then that is something that's that has the potential to have that kind of impact. But the other thing to keep in mind is this a little bit more broadly. American voters generally look for stability. They look for calm. And one of Biden's strongest arguments back in 2020 is he was someone that could restore that calm. Remember, he talked about a return to normalcy. And that's what voters want. They want that sense of security. They want that sense of consistency. And that's what Biden ran on in 2020. Well, if we are seeing these types of mass protests on college campuses, at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago this summer, and into the fall, completely aside from voters' opinions about the Middle East, about Israel, about Gaza, about Hamas, and so on, that overall sense of stability is something that could potentially be threatened. And I think that's a much bigger potential obstacle for Biden than the particulars about the war. Now, as we've all seen, Biden and his administration have been working extremely hard trying to convince the Israelis and Hamas into even a temporary ceasefire, which they believe will lead to a more permanent cessation of hostilities. And it's beginning to look more and more that the Saudi Arabian government is on board with the solution and would bring with them the other Gulf states and other more moderate Arab states. It's important to remember that not just the Saudis, but Jordan, Egypt, Oman, Kuwait, the others, their primary concern in the Middle East now is no longer Israel, it's Iran. And they very badly want an anti-Iran coalition. They want the US to play a more aggressive role. And it would be to their benefit to have Israel as part of that coalition too. The real obstacle here, we can talk more about this in our final portion for anyone who would like to, is that the Saudis and the other Arab states who do want this coalition are now saying they will only do so if there is a two-state solution in which a Palestinian state is created. Israel is resisting that, but it's beginning to look like an agreement between the US and Saudi Arabia is moving forward, potentially even without Israel, which many observers believe would increase the pressure on Israel to join that alliance and therefore to, albeit reluctantly, sign off on a two-state solution. So we don't know, of course, what's going to happen, but Biden at least believes that the best path to peace in the Middle East lies through a two-state solution, but also, although the president wouldn't say it out loud, his campaign advisors would almost certainly tell you that their best path to re-election, to bringing back those young people and those other Democratic progressive voters, is to fashion some type of peace agreement. So this is something that's become more and more important to Biden, not just for geopolitical, real-world reasons, but for his own political prospects too. And I guess the question is, does that increase the chances of a peace agreement? Now, we're asking a slightly less ambitious question, if we can put up the fifth question. We're not necessarily asking you if that grand agreement can come together. But we do want to find out from you is if you think if you do think that there will be a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And our options here, as you can see, say, yes, I think there will be a permanent ceasefire within the next 30 days. Clearly, Tony Blinken is putting enough pressure on both sides to bring this together. Second, well, we're not going to get it done in a month, but in 90 days, maybe by the summer, that there might be some type of ceasefire. Third, well, even 90 days is pretty ambitious, maybe not by the summer, but by election day, Biden will be able to get this done. Fourth, well, I think there'll be a permanent ceasefire at some point, but it's not going to happen before election day. And then fifth, never. There will never be a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. Let's see how optimistic or pessimistic our group is on this one. Very interesting. Exactly half of our group believes that there will be a permanent ceasefire within the next 90 days. So that's early August, a few months before the election. Only 6% think it's going to happen right away. And I think you're right, that's probably a little bit optimistic. But half of our group thinks that between now and early August, with 3 months to go until the election, there will be a permanent ceasefire. And if that does end up being the case, that, along with its real world ramifications, I would argue, is a very, very important benefit for Biden's reelection chances. Another 20% of you say by election day. So it might not have as much of an effect as a few months before the election. But 70% of you believe that there will be a peace agreement by election day. And once again, I believe if that does end up being the case, that helps Biden tremendously. 21% of you say, well, maybe someday, but not this year. The 9% say, never going to happen, Schnur, forget it. So Katie, what do you say? Should we go to questions from our group to let them weigh in a little bit more detail than they can during the polls?
Yeah, definitely. As always, we have a very curious audience tonight, so I'm excited to get started on these questions. The first question being, do you see a further split in the Democrats because of this war?
I do see a bigger split in the Democrats because of the war. There's no question that the more establishment wing of the party, Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, Gavin Newsom, generally tend to stand with Israel as Democrats traditionally have. But it's equally clear, according to polling and according to the public statements from many Democratic officials in response to the campus protests, that there's a growing number of more progressive Democrats who don't believe that the U.S.'s historic alliance with Israel is in this country's best interest. We're seeing that wing of the party growing pretty quickly. And the poll numbers show the numbers growing, particularly going back to what we were discussing earlier, among young people. And so ultimately, the establishment wing of the Democratic Party or the Israeli government and its people, or both, are going to have to find a different and perhaps better way to reach out to these disaffected voters. Because right now, the trend line in the Democratic Party is growing very strongly against Israel. And while a majority of Democratic Party voters still do, in many surveys, support Israel, those numbers are shrinking. And that creates a profound test for the Democratic Party going forward.
Really interesting. And the next question we just got, actually, would a three-state solution with separate deals between Israel and Gaza and Israel and West Bank better bring a reduction in violence in Palestine?
We don't know. And the questioner asked about a three-state solution. I assume they meant a two-state solution with the existing Jewish state of Israel and an adjoining Palestinian state. For years, Israel has believed that creating a Palestinian state would simply give a base to even more terrorist activity. And for about the last 15, 18 years now, many opponents of a two-state solution, both in Israel and here in the US, have pointed to what happened when Israel under Ariel Sharon returned control of Gaza to the Palestinians. And at that point, the hope is that because the territory was being given back to the Palestinians, that might lead to a lessening of violence. And in fact, just the opposite happened, and not too long after that, Hamas took over Gaza, and that's been a problem ever since. That said, the counter argument, it's one being made not just today, but it was one made by Ariel Sharon back when he was prime minister, the Netanyahu of his day, if you will, who argued that a two-state solution, while not an ideal answer, might be the best possible option available to Israel, given that there would be a single state that would ideally be held responsible for its activity, rather than Israel being continued to fight this multi-front challenge with Hezbollah in the north, with Hamas in the south, with the Houthis everywhere, with the West Bank, and so on. From a practical standpoint, the challenge after October 7th is even greater. Polls show that more than 70% of the Israeli people do not want a two-state solution. And so if it were to happen, even toward that broader goal we were talking about earlier, it would require an Israeli leader, either Netanyahu or a successor, to be able to make a very powerful case to the Israeli people that while this isn't an ideal solution, it might be the one that provides the highest level of safety and security compared to the status quo.
Yeah, and I actually just wanted to follow up with the questioner with a clarification on this question. And the audience member said he actually meant a Gaza state, a separate West Bank state, and Israel as a three-state solution. So do you have any thoughts on this?
Hey, I don't know that the broader dynamic would change. I think people who want a Palestinian state would probably rather have one than two. Those who are opposed to a Palestinian state would oppose one or two. But the question does raise an important logistical question, which is that Gaza and the West Bank are not connected. So if there was going to be a Palestinian state, would it be the West Bank? Would it be Gaza? Or would it be a non-contiguous country? I think the likelihood of them being two separate countries is pretty slim. But the questioner does raise an important point about how that would be handled logistically. And I think we need to see a philosophical agreement before getting into those kind of geographic discussions.
Yeah, perfect. And what are your thoughts on how closely the DNC this summer in Chicago will reflect the chaos of the 1968 DNC in the same city?
See, this is why I think Biden needs a peace deal so badly. Because on the current landscape, I think the likelihood for very widespread protest and potentially violence in Chicago this year, as was the case in 1968, I think is a very considerable percentage. I don't know that there's a way to prevent it, but if there is I do think, as I said a moment ago, a peace agreement would almost certainly take a lot of the energy out of those protests. It's a difficult enough challenge for Biden and the Democrats to begin with, but the fact that the conversation is actually taking place in the same city, the city of Chicago, by the way, my favorite city in the country, the fact that the convention is taking place in the same city this summer that it did in 1968 just adds such a strong historical parallel that, in addition to the unrest and protest and potentially violence itself, the history of what happened in 1968, I think is going to encourage even more pushback. I think the one other thing I'd add is this becomes part of a larger question, which is, do progressive voters, young people, voters from underrepresented minority communities, and others who represent the leftmost portion of the political spectrum, sort of the uber question in this election is, will they buy the argument that the Biden campaign will make, which is, you might not love Joe Biden, but if you don't vote, or if you vote for Kennedy, you're electing Donald Trump president. The Biden campaign is supremely confident that the more they remind these young people and other progressives about some of the things that Trump said and did when he was president, and the more they remind those voters of that, the more likely those voters are to come home. But if they do, it's probably not going to be in time for the convention. So I think this summer in Chicago could be a very difficult challenge for the president and his supporters.
And to stay on the topic of young voters for a second, this audience member said, will young potential voters be more inclined not to vote if they do not like either candidate? Is the disaffection of young people towards Biden resulting in votes for Trump, or will they simply not vote?
I think it's relatively unlikely that large numbers of young people will vote for Trump. As we talked about earlier, some young men have switched from Biden to Trump over the last 4 years. But for the most part, the reason that Biden's advantage over Trump in this age group, the reason that advantage is so much smaller is not because they're switching sides, but simply because they're either not going to vote for either candidate or might possibly cast a protest vote for Kennedy or one of the other minor party candidates. So no, most of them are not going to vote for Trump, but Biden needs them to vote for him. If you think about it from Biden's perspective, this gets back to the challenge that Kennedy presents. There's a finite number of voters in this country who will never vote for Donald Trump no matter what. If all of those voters who would never vote for Trump vote for Joe Biden will get elected president. But the more of those voters who either stay home or vote for a third or fourth party candidate, the easier it becomes for Trump to win the election with 45, 46% of the vote. So what the questioner's done is they put their finger precisely on the challenge that Biden's campaign is facing.
What are the chances of Nikki Haley being selected to be Trump's running mate to attract more women and or possibly cut down on the double haters?
Well, it's a really good question at a couple levels. One, Haley's voters almost precisely represent the swing vote in this election. What's been interesting is that the Biden campaign, at least to date, has made a much more aggressive effort to reach out to Haley's supporters than Trump or his campaign had. It doesn't seem probable or even plausible that Trump would name Haley, but the suburban voters who represented the strength of her candidacy could swing the election in his favor. In particular, suburban female voters who might otherwise be inclined to vote Republican but don't really care for Trump might be an additional benefit that Trump could realize. And also, of course, the Trump campaign is facing very severe money challenges. They're having a much more difficult time fundraising than they did in either 2020 or 2016. And so there's increased speculation that Trump might look for a running mate who can appeal to donors. And Haley, of course, was a very, very prolific and successful fundraiser during her candidacy. So it makes sense. It would make sense for Trump to pick Haley for all these political and strategic reasons. But it still seems pretty implausible, given how little effort Trump has made to reach out to her to date. And while that can change, it appears that he is looking in other directions.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you. And moving back to the topic of Israel and Gaza for a minute, what could Israel do to improve its PR image? Would replacing Netanyahu matter at this point? And can there be a ceasefire agreement with Netanyahu in power?
Boy, 3 separate questions, all really good ones. And I might ask you to repeat them to make sure I get them all, Katie, but let me give it a try. First, Israel historically, the state of Israel and its government has not devoted a great deal of time or effort to public relations. I think in that regard, they're somewhat fatalistic and would say, we have to fight for our existence. Worrying about public opinion, worrying about global PR is just a luxury we don't have because we have more real world life and death consequences that have to come before image and reputation. My own opinion as a former PR guy is that if you have improved reputation, it does help build support in the world, which can have a tangible impact. But again, historically, it's just not something on which Israel's government has placed a great deal of priority. The second question was about Netanyahu, was it, Katie? What was it?
Yeah, it's would replacing Netanyahu matter at this point?
I think it would. You look at the polls, and it shows that the majority of Israelis do agree with Netanyahu, for example, that there should not be a Palestinian state. And so what Netanyahu and his supporters point out is they say his critics in the US and elsewhere are criticizing positions that he has that reflect those of the Israeli people. That said, the majority of the Israeli people have now made it clear in polls that they would like to see a new prime minister. And if you go back to the roots, well, if you go back before October 7th, it's worth remembering that Netanyahu became prime minister again by fashioning a coalition with the strongest conservative members of the Knesset, of the Israeli legislature. And he relied on those most conservative members who normally haven't been part of a governing coalition because they were willing to support him in some of the legal troubles that he's been facing. Some of the more centrist, even center-right, even former Likud members and leaders who had stood with Netanyahu under other circumstances would not support him because of some of the legal troubles he was facing at home. And so by putting together this more strongly conservative coalition, Netanyahu limited his options. All of which is to say is that if he did step down, or if he were defeated and were replaced by another center-right leader, someone like Benny Gantz, who's a member of the War Cabinet, the Secretary of the Minister of Defense, Gallant, and our others, all of them would be in a position to form a bipartisan coalition that would be more likely to support a peace agreement than Netanyahu can. Because the members of the Knesset that Netanyahu would need if he wanted to pursue a broader peace agreement are not going to support him because of his legal difficulties. So I would say another Israeli leader, even one who agreed with Netanyahu on most international policy issues, including Gaza, would make a difference. Not because they'd have a different policy position, but they'd have a different governing coalition, which would allow the country to move forward in a way that's not possible at the moment.
Okay, yeah, and just gonna put the third part of that question out there again in case you have any more thoughts before we wrap up. Can there be a ceasefire agreement with Netanyahu in power?
There can, and it's worth noting that even while Netanyahu has made it clear that a peace agreement would not preclude an Israeli invasion of Rafah, it's also worth noting that a Netanyahu-led government has offered a series of immense concessions to Hamas. Israel is now at a point where it's only asking for an immediate return of 33 of the hostages. They've now agreed to allow Palestinian civilians to return to Gaza City and the surrounding area in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. These are immense concessions. So it does appear that Netanyahu does want a peace agreement, if for no other reason than he recognizes that his voters want those hostages home so badly. So the fact that he hasn't gotten it doesn't mean he's not working toward it. Just as I was saying earlier, I think it's more likely, well, I'll say this another way. There could be a ceasefire under Netanyahu. There's more likely to be one, I believe, under another leader.
Okay. I think that was a great question to wrap up on, Dan. And I feel like we covered a lot of ground tonight. So do you have anything to leave our audience with?
No, I agree with you. I think I hope our audience would agree that it was an interesting conversation. I'm glad we did start by talking about American politics, particularly the potential impact of Kennedy and the other minor candidates. It's not surprising that between Kennedy and then campuses, we ended up where we often do, which is the real world crisis that is still occurring in the Middle East. And obviously, we'll be talking about that quite a bit, I'm afraid, for many months to come. But as always, Katie, thank you. I really enjoy these. And I think what we have to do next time, though, is remind me I'm not allowed to answer 3-part questions. That I should only pick out one part so we can get more people's questions in. But we'll know that next time.
Yeah, that sounds great for next time. And Richard, would you like to come back on the screen and close this program out for our audience?
Yes.
Thank you again, Dan.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you.
And Dan, thanks so much for just excellent analysis as always. There's just so much going on right now. I think it was a great session. And Katie, thank you so much for managing all the questions. And thanks to our audience members for your great questions. Very interesting discussion tonight. So thank you all. There, of course, for members only session following this, I certainly welcome all of you to that. All the members to continue on this discussion a bit. But I do want to remind you once more about some of the upcoming events that we have this month, and I hope you'll join us. Once again, it's Senator Steve Daines on Monday, 6 May at the California Club. We have, again, the Small Business Administrator Isabel Guzman on the 22nd of May at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. And then again, Mayor Karen Bass on the 28th. And if you are interested in going to any or all of those events, please sign up on our website. We really love to see you there. But again, thanks, Dan and Katie.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks everybody for being with us.
Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you all all the members on the members only session afterwards. You all have a good night. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.